By 1921, HMS Dreadnought was an old ship in a young navy. 15 years had passed since her revolutionary launch, and the naval world she had helped create was almost unrecognizable. The Portsmouth harbor where she now sat quietly was filled with vessels that traced their design directly back to her innovative concepts. Every major battleship in the world bore her influence, yet most of them had already surpassed her capabilities. It was time for the ship that had changed everything to make her final voyage to the scrapyard. Admiral Fisher, now retired and in his final years, came to see HMS Dreadnought one last time before she was decommissioned. Walking across her familiar deck, he could hardly believe how much the world had changed since that nervous day in 1906, when everyone called his project a piece of junk. The old admiral ran his hand along the metal railings, remembering the doubts, the criticism, and the sleepless nights when he wasn't sure his revolutionary idea would work. The ship's final crew was preparing to remove her guns and equipment, but they worked with unusual reverence. These sailors understood they were dismantling a piece of history. Many of their fathers had served on traditional battleships that HMS Dreadnought had made obsolete overnight. They had grown up hearing stories about the ship that changed naval warfare forever, and now they were witnessing the end of her remarkable career. As Fisher looked around the harbor, he could see HMS Dreadnought's children and grandchildren. The newer battleships were larger, faster, and more heavily armed than his original design, but they all carried her DNA. The concept of the all-big-gun battleship had become so standard that naval architects couldn't imagine designing ships any other way. What had once been a radical experiment was now considered basic common sense. The influence went far beyond just copying her gun arrangement. Dreadnought had proven that revolutionary technological leaps were possible and profitable. Her success had encouraged naval designers around the world to think more boldly and experiment with concepts that previously seemed impossible. The steady, conservative evolution of warship design had been replaced by rapid innovation and constant improvement. During her active service, HMS Dreadnought had participated in the Great War, though ironically she had never fired her guns in anger. The war that many believed her existence had helped trigger kept her busy with patrol duties and convoy escorts, but she never engaged in the massive fleet battles that everyone expected. The naval warfare she had been designed for evolved in directions that no one, including Fisher, had fully anticipated, but her indirect influence on the war was enormous. The Dreadnought arms race she had started shaped the alliance systems that led to the conflict. Germany's desperate attempt to build a fleet capable of challenging British dreadnoughts had created tensions that contributed to the diplomatic crisis of 1914. The massive naval spending triggered by HMS Dreadnought's success had drained treasuries and created economic pressures that made war more likely. The technological innovations pioneered in HMS Dreadnought had applications far beyond naval warfare. The steam turbine engines that powered her were adapted for civilian ships, making ocean travel faster and more efficient. The fire control systems developed for her guns influenced artillery design on land. The steel-making techniques perfected for her armor improved construction methods in countless other industries. Young naval officers who had served aboard HMS Dreadnought during her active years were now admirals themselves, leading fleets that bore little resemblance to the navies of their youth. They had learned their profession on a ship that represented the cutting edge of technology, and that experience had shaped their entire approach to naval warfare. They understood that innovation wasn't just helpful, it was essential for survival. The ship's influence extended to countries that had never built dreadnoughts of their own. Smaller naval powers studied her design principles and adapted them to their more modest resources. Coastal defense ships, cruisers, and even destroyers incorporated lessons learned from HMS Dreadnought's revolutionary approach to naval architecture. Perhaps most importantly, this Dreadnought had changed how people thought about military technology. Before her success, most military leaders believed that gradual improvement was the safest approach. New weapons should be slightly better than old ones, but radical changes were too risky to attempt. The dreadnought proved that bold innovation could provide overwhelming advantages to those brave enough to attempt it. This lesson resonated far beyond naval circles. Army officers began questioning traditional approaches to land warfare. Aviation. Pioneers used HMS Dreadnought's example to argue for investment in experimental aircraft. Even civilian industries began to see that revolutionary changes in technology could create enormous competitive advantages. The economic impact of HMS Dreadnought's success was still being felt years after her retirement. The shipbuilding industry had been completely transformed by the need to construct these massive, complex vessels. Skills that had been adequate for building traditional warships were no longer sufficient. Workers had been forced to learn new techniques, and entire educational systems had been restructured to train the engineers and technicians needed for modern naval construction. Steel production had increased dramatically to meet the demand for dreadnought armor plating. Gun manufacturing had evolved to produce the massive weapons these ships required. Even seemingly unrelated industries like electrical generation and precision machining had been pushed to new levels of capability by the challenges of building advanced battleships. The social changes were equally significant. The success of HMS Dreadnought had made naval officers into celebrities and national heroes. Young people who might have chosen other careers were drawn to the Navy by the excitement of working with cutting-edge technology. The prestige associated with naval service increased dramatically, changing the character of the officer corps and attracting more talented individuals. As the final equipment was removed from HMS Dreadnought, workers found personal items left behind by sailors who had served aboard her over the years. Letters from home, photographs of families, small mementos that reminded these men of the world beyond the steel walls of their revolutionary ship. These simple human artifacts provided a poignant reminder that for all her technological significance, HMS Dreadnought had been home to thousands of ordinary sailors who had helped make naval history. The scrapping process itself became a kind of celebration. Metal from HMS Dreadnought was used to build new ships, ensuring that her physical substance would continue serving the Royal Navy even after her useful life had ended. Some of her steel went into merchant vessels, carrying cargo and passengers around the world. Other pieces became part of coastal fortifications, still protecting Britain decades after the ship herself had been dismantled. Fisher died in 1920, just 1 year before his greatest creation was decommissioned. He never lived to see the final vindication of his vision, but he had witnessed enough to know that HMS Dreadnought had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The ship that critics had called Fisher's Folly had not only worked, it had fundamentally changed how humanity approached technological innovation. Today, naval historians recognize HMS Dreadnought as one of the most influential warships ever built. She proved that radical innovation could succeed spectacularly, that traditional wisdom wasn't always wise, and that those brave enough to challenge conventional thinking could change the world. The piece of junk that everyone had mocked became the foundation for modern naval warfare and a lasting symbol of human ingenuity triumphing over skepticism and doubt. The moment HMS Dreadnought completed her sea trials, everything changed. Within hours, telegraph messages were racing across the globe, carrying news that would shake every major naval power to its core. The British had done the impossible. They had built a warship so advanced that it made every other battleship in the world look like an antique. And now every nation had to face an uncomfortable truth. Their entire naval strategy was suddenly worthless. In Germany, Admiral Tirpitz was having what his staff politely called a very bad day. The German Navy had been spending enormous sums building traditional battleships, confident that they were creating a fleet capable of challenging British supremacy. Now, overnight, those ships had become second-rate vessels. Tirpitz stared at the reports from his naval attaché in London, reading the performance specifications of HMS Dreadnought again and again, hoping to find some exaggeration or mistake. But the numbers were clear and terrifying. The German admiral called an emergency meeting with his top naval architects and engineers. The room was tense as officers who had been proud of their fleet's progress suddenly realized they were facing obsolescence. One of the younger engineers finally broke the silence by asking the question everyone was thinking: how do we respond to this? The answer was obvious but expensive. Germany would have to start over, designing completely new battleships based on the British model, but Germany wasn't the only country scrambling to respond. In the United States, naval planners were having similar emergency meetings. The American Navy had been building powerful battleships of its own, ships that were considered among the best in the world. Now those vessels looked pathetic compared to HMS Dreadnought. American naval architects worked through the night, redesigning their latest battleship plans to incorporate the revolutionary concepts the British had proven successful. The French Navy faced an even worse situation. France had been focusing on smaller, faster ships, believing that mobility was more important than raw firepower. Dreadnought proved that theory completely wrong. A ship that could move at 21 knots while carrying 10 massive guns could catch any French vessel and destroy it with ease. French naval officers looked at their fleet and realized they had been preparing for the wrong kind of war entirely. In Japan, the reaction was perhaps the most intense of all. The Japanese had recently defeated the Russian Navy in a spectacular victory, proving that Asian naval power could match European technology. But HMS Dreadnought threatened to undo all of Japan's progress. Japanese engineers studied every available detail about the British ship, trying to understand how they could build similar vessels with their more limited industrial resources. Russia, still recovering from their naval defeat by Japan, faced the most hopeless situation. Their remaining ships were already outdated before HMS Dreadnought appeared. Now they were so far behind that catching up seemed impossible. Russian naval officers debated whether they should even try to compete or simply accept that their country would never again be a major naval power. But the real panic wasn't happening in military headquarters. It was spreading through the shipyards and naval construction facilities of every major power. Companies that had been building traditional battleships suddenly found their expertise worthless. Workers who had spent decades perfecting the construction of mixed armament warships discovered that their skills were no longer relevant. Entire industries had to retrain or risk being left behind. The speed of change was breathtaking. Before this Dreadnought, naval development had been gradual and predictable. Ships evolved slowly, with each new design being only slightly better than the previous one. But Fisher's revolutionary battleship had created what historians would later call a technological discontinuity. The rules of naval warfare had been rewritten overnight, and everyone was scrambling to catch up. Within 6 months of Dreadnought's successful trials, every major naval power had announced plans for similar ships. The German Navy revealed designs for the Nassau-class battleships, vessels that would closely copy the British innovations. The United States Navy began construction of USS South Carolina and USS Michigan, American interpretations of the Dreadnought concept. France, Japan, Italy, and even smaller naval powers like Argentina and Brazil announced their own Dreadnought programs. The global arms race that followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Countries that had been content with modest naval forces suddenly felt compelled to build expensive new fleets. The cost was staggering. A single Dreadnought battleship cost more than most nations spent on their entire military in a typical year. But no country wanted to be left defenseless against these new superweapons. The political implications were enormous. Treaties and alliances that had been based on naval balance suddenly became meaningless. Countries that had felt secure behind their traditional battleship fleets now faced the terrifying possibility of being attacked by enemies with Dreadnought-type vessels. Diplomatic relationships shifted as nations tried to either acquire this new technology or ally themselves with countries that possessed it. Britain initially benefited enormously from their head start. HMS Dreadnought gave them a technological advantage that would last for several years, while other countries struggled to design and build their own advanced battleships. British shipyards worked at maximum capacity, building additional dreadnoughts to maintain their lead. The Royal Navy's supremacy, which had been challenged by the rapid expansion of other fleets, was suddenly secure again, but Fisher understood that this advantage was temporary. Other countries had talented engineers and capable shipyards. They would eventually build dreadnoughts as good as or better than the British originals. The key was to stay ahead of the competition by continuing to innovate. Fisher immediately began planning even more advanced designs, ships that would make the first generation of dreadnoughts look primitive. The human cost of this arms race was significant. Thousands of workers in traditional shipyards lost their jobs as older construction methods became obsolete. Entire communities that had depended on naval construction found themselves struggling to adapt to new technologies and methods. The pace of change was so rapid that experienced workers often couldn't keep up with the demands of building these revolutionary new ships. At the same time, the arms race created opportunities for those who could adapt. Engineers who understood the new technologies found themselves in high demand. Shipyards that successfully retooled for dreadnought construction became incredibly profitable. Steel companies, armor manufacturers, and gunmakers all benefited from the massive increase in naval spending that followed HMS Dreadnought's success, the ship that critics had called. Fisher's folly had done more than prove its creator right. It had fundamentally altered the balance of world power and triggered a competition that would continue for decades. Nations that had been content with modest naval forces now felt compelled to spend enormous sums on advanced warships. The peaceful oceans of the early 20th century suddenly seemed much more dangerous. Fisher watched this global transformation with mixed feelings. He was proud that his vision had been vindicated so completely, but he also understood that he had unleashed forces that might lead to conflict on an unprecedented scale. The dreadnought battleships now being built around the world were not just symbols of national prestige. They were weapons of war, and sooner or later, someone would use them for their intended purpose. The naval world would never be the same. HMS Dreadnought had opened a door that could never be closed, starting an arms race that would reshape global politics and ultimately contribute to the tensions that would explode into the First World War. The piece of junk that everyone had mocked had become the most influential warship in history. The morning of October 3, 1906, was cold and gray in Portsmouth. Fog hung over the shipyard like a blanket, and workers arrived early, knowing this would be the most important day in British naval history. After exactly 1 year and 1 day of backbreaking work, HMS Dreadnought was ready for launch. But nobody really knew if Fisher's revolutionary dream would float or become the most expensive disaster in naval history. Crowds gathered despite the early hour and miserable weather. Government officials, naval officers, shipyard workers, and curious locals all wanted to witness what many were calling either the birth of modern naval warfare or the death of Admiral Fisher's career. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Everyone had an opinion, but nobody had any real idea what would happen when that massive hull hit the water. Fisher stood on the launching platform, trying to look confident while his stomach churned with nerves. He had staked everything on this moment. His reputation, his career, and Britain's naval future all depended on the next few minutes. If HMS Dreadnought launched successfully, he would be hailed as a visionary. If something went wrong, he would be remembered as the man who wasted millions on a floating catastrophe. The ship itself was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Traditional battleships looked busy and cluttered with guns of different sizes scattered across their decks, but Dreadnought was clean and purposeful. Her 5 massive gun turrets dominated the silhouette, making every other warship in Portsmouth Harbor look like a toy. Even sitting in the building dock, she radiated power and menace, but looking impressive and actually working were two completely different things. The shipyard workers who had built her were proud of their craftsmanship, but they also knew how many untested technologies were packed into that steel hull. The steam turbines had never been tried on a ship this size. The fire control system was completely experimental. The armor arrangement was based on theories that had never been proven in battle. The launch ceremony began with speeches from government officials, but everyone was really waiting for the moment when the supports would be knocked away and gravity would take over. Would the ship slide gracefully into the water as planned? Would she roll over and sink immediately? Would the hull crack under its own massive weight? These weren't idle concerns. Ship launches had gone wrong before, sometimes spectacularly. The signal came, and workers began knocking away the wooden supports that had held Dreadnought in place during construction. The process seemed to take forever, with each support making a loud crash as it fell away. The massive ship remained motionless for several heart-stopping seconds. Then, slowly, almost majestically, she began to move. The crowd held its breath. As HMS Dreadnought picked up speed on the slipway, 18,000 tons of steel and machinery slid toward the water with increasing momentum. For a moment, it looked like the ship might be moving too fast. What if she couldn't be stopped? What if she crashed into the far side of the harbor? But the calculations had been correct. She hit the water with a tremendous splash and settled into her natural element like she belonged there. The cheer that went up from the crowd was deafening. Workers who had labored for a year on the project shouted with relief and pride. Naval officers who had doubted Fisher's vision found themselves applauding despite their reservations. Even the newspaper reporters, who had been hoping for a dramatic failure to write about, seemed caught up in the excitement of the moment, but Fisher knew the real test was just beginning. Getting the ship into the water was only the first step. Now came the sea trials, where every system would be tested under actual operating conditions. The turbine engines had to prove they could push 18,000 tons of steel through the water at the promised speed. The guns had to demonstrate they could fire accurately and reload quickly. The entire ship had to show she could handle the stresses of real naval operations. The first engine tests were scheduled for the following week, and Fisher barely slept during the interval. What if the turbines failed? What if they couldn't generate enough power? What if the experimental technology that looked so promising on paper turned out to be useless in practice? The questions multiplied in his mind, but there was nothing to do but wait and see. When HMS Dreadnought first fired up her engines, the sound was unlike anything anyone had heard before. Traditional battleships made a steady thumping noise as their reciprocating engines pushed them through the water. But Dreadnought's turbines created a smooth, almost musical hum that seemed to vibrate through the entire harbor. It was the sound of the future, and everyone who heard it knew they were witnessing something historic. The speed trials exceeded everyone's expectations. Fisher had promised that Dreadnought would be faster than any existing battleship, but even he was amazed when she easily reached 21 knots during her first test run. Most battleships of the time struggled to reach 18 knots, and many were slower than that. Suddenly, Britain had a warship that could outrun anything it couldn't outfight, and outfight anything it couldn't outrun. The gunnery tests were even more impressive. When all 10 main guns fired together for the first time, the sound was like thunder, and the concussion broke windows in buildings miles away. But more importantly, the fire control system worked exactly as designed. All 10 guns hit the target area simultaneously, creating a devastating concentration of firepower that no existing ship could match. Naval observers from other countries watched the trials with growing alarm. They had hoped HMS Dreadnought would fail, proving that their traditional battleship designs were still adequate. Instead, they were witnessing the birth of a new type of warship that made their entire fleets obsolete overnight. The ship they had mocked as Fisher's folly was performing better than its most optimistic supporters had dared to hope. Word of Dreadnought's performance spread quickly through naval circles around the world. In Germany, Admiral Tirpitz immediately began planning similar ships. In the United States, naval architects started redesigning their latest battleships to incorporate Dreadnought's innovations. In France, Italy, Japan, and Russia, government officials demanded to know why their navies didn't have ships like this revolutionary British vessel, but perhaps the most satisfying moment for Fisher came when senior British naval officers who had opposed his project began changing their tune. The same men who had called HMS Dreadnought a waste of money were now praising Fisher's vision and asking when the next ship of her type would be completed. The transformation was remarkable and complete. The press coverage was equally dramatic. Newspapers that had ridiculed Fisher's folly now hailed HMS Dreadnought as a triumph of British engineering and naval innovation. Editorial writers who had predicted disaster were suddenly praising the government's wisdom in supporting such a forward-thinking project. The ship that had been a laughingstock during construction became a source of national pride the moment she proved herself at sea. Fisher allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, but he also knew this was just the beginning. HMS Dreadnought had proven that his revolutionary concepts worked, but other nations would quickly copy his innovations. The advantage Britain had gained would only last as long as it took other countries to build their own advanced battleships. The naval arms race Fisher had started was about to accelerate beyond anything the world had ever seen. The moment Admiral Fisher got approval for his revolutionary battleship, everything changed. What had been an idea on paper suddenly became a real project with real deadlines and real consequences. And the first challenge was bigger than anyone expected. Fisher had promised to build the most advanced warship in history in just 1 year. Most battleships took 3 to 4 years to complete. Everyone thought Fisher had lost his mind. The Portsmouth shipyard became a place of controlled chaos almost overnight. Workers arrived to find blueprints that looked nothing like any ship they had ever built. The traditional layout of guns scattered across the deck was gone. Instead, the plans showed 5 massive gun turrets arranged in a completely new pattern. Each turret would house 2 enormous 12-inch guns, creating a ship with more firepower than most entire fleets, but drawing something on paper and actually building it are 2 completely different things. The shipyard foreman looked at the plans and immediately spotted problems. The gun turrets were so large and heavy that they would need foundations built deep into the ship's structure. This meant starting construction in a completely different way than usual. Instead of building the hull first and adding guns later, they would need to build the gun foundations and the hull at the same time. The workers were nervous. Many of them had been building ships for decades, following methods passed down from their fathers and grandfathers. Now they were being asked to throw out everything they knew and try techniques that had never been tested. What if the new methods didn't work? What if the ship fell apart during construction? What if they couldn't meet Fisher's impossible deadline? The pressure was enormous. Fisher visited the shipyard almost every day, checking on progress and pushing for faster work. He understood that other countries were watching Britain's experiment closely. If HMS Dreadnought took too long to build, rival nations would have time to develop their own advanced ships. The advantage Fisher was hoping to create would disappear before the ship was even finished. The steam turbine engines created their own set of problems. Traditional battleships used reciprocating engines that were slow but reliable. Everyone knew how to maintain them and fix them when they broke. But turbines were completely different. They spun at incredibly high speeds and required precision engineering that pushed the limits of what was possible in 1906. The turbine manufacturers sent their best engineers to Portsmouth, but even they weren't sure the technology would work on such a massive scale. The engines for HMS Dreadnought would be larger and more powerful than any turbines ever built. Testing them was impossible until they were actually installed in the ship. If they failed, there would be no backup plan. The entire project would collapse. Meanwhile, the gunmakers faced their own challenges. Creating 10 identical 12-inch guns was a manufacturing nightmare. Each gun had to be precisely calibrated to fire at exactly the same angle and velocity. If even one gun was slightly different, it would throw off the entire firing system. The metallurgy had to be perfect. The machining had to be exact. And everything had to be finished on schedule. The fire control system was perhaps the most complex challenge of all. Traditional battleships had gun crews that aimed and fired independently. But Fisher's vision required all 10 main guns to work together as a single weapon system. This meant creating a centralized control system that could calculate ranges, wind speeds, and target movements for all guns simultaneously. The technology needed for this system barely existed. Engineers had to invent new instruments for measuring distances and calculating firing solutions. They had to design communication systems that could instantly relay commands to gun crews scattered throughout the ship. They had to create backup systems in case the primary controls were damaged in battle. And they had to make it all simple. Enough that sailors could learn to use it quickly. As construction progressed, problems seemed to multiply daily. Steel deliveries were delayed because the special armor plating required new manufacturing techniques. The shipyard's cranes weren't powerful enough to lift the massive gun turrets, so new equipment had to be designed and built. Workers discovered that the ship's electrical systems would be far more complex than originally planned, requiring miles of wiring and dozens of generators. The cost overruns were staggering. Every week brought new expenses that hadn't been anticipated. The government officials who had approved the project began to panic. They demanded explanations from Fisher, who could only promise that the final result would be worth the investment. But privately, even Fisher was starting to worry. What if he had promised something that was impossible to deliver? Newspaper reporters hung around the shipyard gates, trying to get information about the mysterious project. Workers were forbidden from talking to journalists, but rumors leaked out anyway. Some reports claimed the ship was months behind schedule. Others suggested that major design flaws had been discovered. A few newspapers ran stories, claiming the entire project would be canceled. The worst moment came when one of the massive gun turrets cracked during installation. Engineers discovered that the stress of lifting the turret into position had caused a fracture in the armor plating. For a few terrifying days, it looked like the entire construction schedule would have to be scrapped while a new turret was built. Fisher barely slept during this crisis, working with engineers to find a solution that wouldn't destroy his timeline. Fortunately, the crack turned out to be repairable, but the incident highlighted how close the project was to complete failure. At every moment, there was no room for error and no time for delays. Every component had to work perfectly the first time, and every installation had to go smoothly. The pressure on the workers was intense. Despite all the problems, something remarkable was happening. In the Portsmouth shipyard, the workers were starting to take pride in building something that had never existed before. They began to understand that they weren't just building another battleship. They were creating a piece of history. The ship that critics called Fisher's Folly was starting to look like something extraordinary. The hull took shape faster than anyone expected. The new construction methods, despite their challenges, turned out to be more efficient than traditional techniques. The gun turrets, once properly installed, looked more impressive than even the blueprints had suggested. The turbine engines, when they finally arrived from the manufacturer, were works of art as much as pieces of machinery. But Fisher knew that looking good and actually working were two different things. The real test would come when HMS Dreadnought left the shipyard and went to sea. Until then, everything was just theory and hope. The ship that was supposed to revolutionize naval warfare was still just a collection of steel plates and machinery that might or might not work as designed. As the construction deadline approached, the entire British naval establishment held its breath. Fisher's reputation, Britain's naval supremacy, and millions of pounds in taxpayer money all depended on whether the workers at Portsmouth could complete their impossible task. The ship that had started as one man's crazy idea was about to become reality, for better or worse. Picture this. It's 1906, and the world's most powerful navies are locked in a deadly competition. Every major nation wants to control the seas, and that means building bigger, stronger warships than anyone else. But there's one man in Britain who thinks everyone is doing it wrong. Completely wrong. Admiral Sir John Fisher sits in his office at the British Admiralty, staring at drawings of battleships that look nothing like anything the world has ever seen. While other naval officers are content with the traditional approach of mixing different-sized guns on their ships, Fisher has a crazy idea. What if they built a warship with nothing but big guns? What if they threw out everything everyone thought they knew about battleship design? The idea seems insane to almost everyone who hears it. Traditional battleships of the time carry a mix of weapons. They have a few large guns for long-range fighting, some medium-sized guns for mid-range combat, and smaller guns to fight off torpedo boats and other fast ships. It's a system that has worked for decades. Why change it now? But Fisher sees something. Others don't. He's been watching how naval battles actually happen, and he's noticed a pattern. When ships fight at long range, only the biggest guns matter. The smaller guns can't reach far enough to be useful, and when ships get close enough for the smaller guns to work, the battle is usually already decided. So why waste money, and space on guns that don't really help win fights? His vision is simple but revolutionary. Build a ship with 10 massive 12-inch guns, nothing smaller. Make it fast enough to catch any enemy ship or run away from any fight it can't win. Give it armor thick enough to protect it from enemy fire. Create a ship so powerful that it makes every other battleship in the world look like a toy. The problems start almost immediately. When Fisher presents his idea to other naval officers, many of them think he's lost his mind. They point out obvious flaws in his thinking. If a ship only has big guns, what happens when fast enemy ships get close? How do you defend against torpedo boats? What about the cost? These massive guns are incredibly expensive. Building a ship with 10 of them would cost more than most countries spend on their entire navy in a year. Fisher listens to their concerns, but he's already thought of answers. The ship will be fast enough that enemy vessels won't be able to get close. And if they do, the massive guns can be loaded with special shells designed to destroy smaller ships. As for the cost, Fisher argues that one super powerful ship is worth more than 3 or 4 traditional battleships. It's not about spending more money. It's about spending money more wisely. But even Fisher's supporters have doubts. The technology he's proposing doesn't fully exist yet. He wants to power the ship with steam turbines instead of traditional engines. Turbines are faster and more efficient, but they've never been used on a ship this large. What if they break down? What if they can't provide enough power? Traditional engines might be slower, but at least everyone knows they work. Then there's the problem of actually aiming and firing 10 massive guns at the same time. Current battleships struggle to coordinate just 4 large guns. How do you control 10? How do you make sure they're all aimed at the right target? How do you reload them quickly enough to maintain a steady rate of fire? The logistics seem impossible. The British government is also nervous about the cost. The ship Fisher is proposing would be the most expensive warship ever built. If it fails, it could bankrupt the naval budget for years. And what if other countries don't try to copy it? Britain would have spent a fortune on a ship that gives them no real advantage. Newspapers start picking up rumors about Fisher's project, and they're not kind. They call it Fisher's folly and suggest that the admiral has become obsessed with an impossible dream. Political cartoons show Fisher as a mad scientist trying to build a floating monster that will drain Britain's treasury. Some critics suggest that Fisher should be removed from his position before he can waste any more of the nation's money, even within the Royal Navy. There's serious resistance. Older officers argue that traditional battleship design has served Britain well for generations. Why risk everything on an untested concept? What if the new ship is too complicated to operate? What if sailors can't learn to use all the new technology? What if the ship is so different from existing vessels that it can't work with the rest of the fleet? But Fisher has one crucial advantage. He's not just any naval officer. He's one of the most respected and successful admirals in British history. He's proven himself in battle and in peacetime. When he speaks, people listen even if they don't always agree. And he's passionate about his vision in a way that starts to convince even the skeptics. Fisher begins holding private meetings with key government officials and influential naval officers. He doesn't just explain his technical ideas. He paints a picture of what naval warfare will look like in the future. He shows them that other countries are already starting to experiment with similar concepts. Germany is building larger ships with bigger guns. The United States is testing new technologies. If Britain doesn't act soon, they'll fall behind in the naval race that's becoming more important every year. Slowly, carefully, Fisher starts to build support for his project. He finds allies among younger officers who are excited by new technology. He convinces government officials that the risk of building the ship is smaller than the risk of not building it. He argues that if Britain can create this revolutionary warship before anyone else, they'll have a huge advantage that could last for years. The technical challenges are enormous. But Fisher has faith in British engineering. The country has a long history of naval innovation. British shipbuilders have created some of the most advanced vessels in the world. If anyone can solve the problems involved in building Fisher's dream ship, it's them. Finally, after months of debate and discussion, Fisher gets the approval he's been fighting for. The British Admiralty agrees to fund his revolutionary battleship, but they make it clear that this is Fisher's project. If it succeeds, he'll get the credit. If it fails, he'll take the blame. The ship will be called HMS Dreadnought, and it will either prove Fisher's vision correct or destroy his reputation forever. As construction begins in the Portsmouth shipyard, the entire naval world watches with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Some hope the British will succeed and create a new type of warship that will make naval warfare more effective. Others hope they'll fail spectacularly, proving that traditional designs are still the best approach. Fisher doesn't care about the doubters. He knows what he's trying to create, and he believes it will change everything. The ship that critics call a piece of junk will either revolutionize naval warfare or become the most expensive mistake in British naval history. There's no middle ground, and Fisher is betting everything on being right.